Chapter 1 The Waking. I told you I can't induce him to wake up right now. His body is under immense stress. If I do, he paused, you won't get any answers. The hesitation was self-explanatory. There was a sigh of frustration on some sort of speakerphone, followed by muffled conversation. Everything felt numb, and the light directly above him blurred any attempts to focus. The voices in the room, the lights, the aching limbs, the throbbing in his skull, it was all present, and yet numbed. He laid still, unable to move his arms, but also lacking the strength to do so. He listened more intently, focusing on the man's voice. He was in the room, maybe 20 to 30 feet away. There were other voices too, two men and a woman. He heard the tones, but not quite the words, as they increased in volume, engaged in the argument. Hal groaned, and he tried reaching for his face. Everything still felt intact as his palms patted his skin. His eyes ached, and as his fingertips touched an adhesive cloth covering them. He gently pulled, wincing and letting out a sigh of pain. Claire, I think our patient might have woken up. The man's voice was only a few feet away now, and Hal immediately stopped and turned defensive. Even with his eyes covered, he could sense that the man was approaching. Mr. Hal Brent, can you hear me? His tone was gentle. Here, let me help you with that. A warm hand pressed against his face, and Hal jolted back, swatting away the doctor's hands. Stay back! He was not going to volunteer any information. Why am I blindfolded? Mr. Brent, my name is Robert Prossman. I'm the station's doctor here. He sounded confused, but he didn't make any second attempts to touch his face again. You're on a research base here on Soldier Key. We found... Soldier Key? In the Atlantic? He interrupted him. Had he landed somewhere in the Florida Keys? Mr. Brent, let me help you with those so that you can see. He reached again for Hal's face, and with a slight flinch, Prossman pulled the slim web tape from his eyelids. I'm sorry about that. You had a seizure when you first arrived, and your pupils were dilated. The webbed tape was to help keep the light out. It was overwhelming. He hadn't seen fluorescent sunlight or lights in some time, and it took him a few moments before he attempted to open his eyes again. Robert, the woman's voice came through some sort of intercom system. Yes, Claire, the doctor replied, turning toward the intercom. He's awake. I don't think this is a good time to tell Troy, though. He's very disoriented. Let me finish treating him before Troy hears about this. I can't stall him for very long. If it's okay, I'd like to see him. She paused. I'll be there in a few minutes. His vision was blurry, and he could see the doctor walking around what looked like a sterile sick bay. The room was well lit, a little too well lit. On the second level, he could see the faint glow of electronic equipment. A single workstation stood out from the rest, littered with snack bags and pop cans, but the rest of the room was otherwise sterile enough for surgery. The doctor had a crook in his step, but busily walked towards his littered workbench. He pulled something that looked like a clipboard from the pile and began touching the illuminated surface. That was new. Hal had seen tablets before. These were different. The entire surface was transparent, and it lit up the doctor's wrinkly face. You said I'm on Soldier Key. Has my crew been found? Hal began to sit upright, gripping the padded bed for balance. Excuse me? The doctor turned and looked at him with a puzzled face. He was a frail, older man, with the exception of a few dozen hairs, he was completely bald. Gravity had had some effects over the years, shown in his slight hunch, and he definitely wasn't a physical threat. Hal was beginning to focus more and more on his surroundings. How long has this place been on the island? This is a large complex for Soldier Key. The doctor laughed. I wish I could take credit for building it, but I'm not as sturdy as I once was. The man proudly held up the clipboard to his chest and puffed up as if showing his strength and stability. My building skills are with much smaller things. Genetics. He smiled, but he didn't seem to understand the question. No, there was a large construction team some years back. Most of the complex is actually underwater. He lifted his eyebrows with interest. What? Hal frequently flew over the Keys and surely would have noticed a complex this large before. Ah, I bet you have some catching up to do. The doctor looked down at his clipboard and touched in a few things before laying it back down on the pile of desk junk. You see, you're at a research base here on Soldier Key. This is A&H's headquarters. We dabble in a little bit of everything now, but a few years back there was this indestructible glass, Pax. He began to fidget. I know it's a stupid name, but the makers wanted their names to be known for something. But anyway, the construction industry, oh, how we've revolutionized how we build. Hal closed his eyes tightly and put his hands over his eyes. Wait. When did this happen? Why am I on a research station that makes glass? Oh, we found you. His voice was chipper, like he was some sort of prize. You were floating on a piece of wreckage in the middle of the Atlantic. Hal's hands dropped and his eyes were wide open. We had a search team out towards Bermuda looking for two of our freighters. They were heading towards St. George to another smaller facility, but midway they lost power and just disappeared off of our radar. He looked down at his hands as he began to fidget his fingers. I'm not really at liberty to talk about it, but during our search we found you gripping onto some of the floating wreckage, although we're still not entirely sure what part of the ship it was. His eyes wandered downward in disappointment as he recalled the lost ships. The doctor still hadn't explained much, and what he had didn't make a whole lot of sense to Hal. Why a glass company? A genetic research doctor? Was he heavily medicated or having some sort of hallucination? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Is this an okay time? Hal could tell by the voice that she was the same woman from the intercom. Yes, come on in, Claire. Our patient has come to life. The doctor lifted his arms with enthusiasm as if a miracle had somehow just happened, and he was now presenting Hal to the new audience. The woman smiled politely at Hal and took a seat in the doctor's chair, holding a clipboard against her chest. She had dark red hair that was loosely held back by a clip, and she wore business pants and a white-collar lab shirt. Mr. Brent, I'm Claire Cass. I'm one of the employees here. You're on a science research station called A&H. Your doctor here already filled me in, but I still don't understand. Why am I here? He looked down at his arms where the new bruises and scratch marks still existed. She clasped her hands together. This is going to sound a bit confusing, she paused, fussing a little with her pen and then making eye contact. I don't know how to say this, Mr. Brent, but you died on August 21st, 2013. Hal froze. He looked forward, not sure if he'd heard correctly. There was a long silence, and all of his thoughts paused, realizing that she was completely serious. You look rather good for a dead guy, the doctor remarked. You should be 71 years old by now. Claire quickly spun around, and he immediately realized it wasn't funny. Well, I mean, never mind. Mr. Brent, you were lost at sea and presumed to be dead. Claire rephrased her comment. She paused, considering the news must have been devastating, but it was only a small piece of the puzzle. That was over 26 years ago. Hal tried to grasp what was being just said. The words were echoing, and he still wasn't sure he'd heard them correctly. With blank thoughts, he looked at her and then back at the doctor. Her expression seemed concerned and anticipating. Dr. Prossman shuffled behind Claire anxiously, awaiting for an opportunity to speak. He looked at Hal with fascination, trying to hold back his eager questions. He held off for a few seconds, biting his lip. He was fixated on Hal. It's like a time warp. He stared for a moment. Claire dropped her head at the remark. Prossman was a curious man, and although his humor wasn't always sympathetic, she couldn't help but smile at his ridiculous inquiry. The shocked stranger didn't show any reaction. There are going to be a few men coming in soon to ask you a few questions. I know that you have a lot of your own, but if you can help us, we may be able to find some of your answers as well. Hal continued to look forward, just staring in the general direction without movement. There wasn't much that she could say. There was a dead man sitting on their lab table, and aside from the ancient facts on paper, there was no explanation for his arrival. My passengers, his voice was monotone. I had passengers on my plane. His report was fairly short, giving a brief history of his military career and even a shorter blurb about his flight school that he taught at just outside of Miami. She sat back down on the bench across from him. Hal was still in a daze, but he seemed to be listening. Your plane disappeared from the radar about a mile off the coast near Bimini. The waters are fairly shallow in those areas, but no one ever found the wreckage or your passengers. She avoided using the word bodies. He had enough to deal with on his mind. I'll leave you alone for a while, Mr. Brent. Dr. Prossman will stay here in case you need anything. She wasn't always the most comforting person, but she leaned forward and tried to assure him that things would be okay. You're safe here. We'll do what we can to figure this out. Honestly, she was only trying to be optimistic.